A widow saw Jesus Christ at her husband's funeral, and she was never the same again. The church was so quiet that even the soft creak of the wooden pews sounded too loud. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting broken colors across the aisle where the casket rested, polished oak, closed for the final time. To most of the mourners, this was just another funeral in a small American town. Another hymn, another goodbye. But not to Grace Coleman. She stood frozen beside the casket, her black veil trembling slightly as her hands tightened around her daughter's fingers. Lily felt it, the sudden change in her mother's grip, the sharp intake of breath that didn't belong to grief alone. Across the aisle, a few parishioners noticed Grace's face pale, her eyes fixed on something no one else seemed to see. Near the head of the casket, just beyond the line of flowers, stood a man dressed in white. He wasn't part of the choir, he wasn't clergy, and yet the air around him felt different still, heavy, unmistakably calm. Grace's heart began to pound as his eyes met hers. There was no accusation in that gaze, no pity, only a depth of compassion so overwhelming it cut through the noise of mourning like silence after a storm. The priest continued the prayers. The organ played softly. Life went on, except for Grace. Because in that single moment, standing at her husband's casket, she knew, without words, without doubt, that she was looking at Jesus Christ. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. No one else reacted. No one turned. But Grace swayed, barely catching herself, her world splitting between what everyone saw and what she alone had just witnessed. And from that instant forward, nothing in her life would ever be the same. The town of Redwood Hollow, Texas, had always moved at a gentle, predictable pace. One main street, one Catholic church with a weathered bell tower. A place where everyone knew when the Coleman porch light stayed on too late or when the school flag was lowered to half-staff. Faith here wasn't loud or theatrical. It lived in routine. Sunday Mass, Wednesday catechism, prayers whispered before supper. Now, the town moved differently. Ethan Coleman's funeral had ended, but the weight of his absence lingered in every corner of Redwood Hollow. Neighbors spoke in hushed voices at the diner. Teachers exchanged worried glances in the school hallway. People didn't ask how Grace was doing anymore. They already knew the answer. Grace returned home with Lily and Noah to a house that felt suddenly unfamiliar. Ethan's boots were still by the door, dusted from the last job he never finished. His coffee mug sat untouched by the sink. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked too loudly, marking seconds that no longer made sense. To Grace, time had stopped at the altar, beside the casket. Everything after that felt borrowed. Lily tried to be brave, folding laundry that didn't need folding, watching her mother when she thought no one noticed. Noah, too young to understand death but old enough to feel it, asked when Dad was coming back, then fell silent when no one answered. Their grief spoke in different ways, but it filled the house all the same. In Redwood Hollow, people brought casseroles and condolences. They quoted scripture with good intentions. God has a plan. He's in a better place. Grace nodded politely, but the words slid past her. Faith had always been steady in her life, quiet, dependable. Now it felt fragile, like a candle threatened by every passing draft. At night, when the children finally slept, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from her. She replayed the final days, the promises she and Ethan had made years ago before God and witnesses, that they would endure, in faith, whatever came. She wanted to believe those vows still meant something. She needed them to. Outside, the town lights dimmed one by one, but inside the Coleman house, grief stayed awake. And beneath it, unspoken, unexplained, something else stirred, waiting to be understood. The funeral mass unfolded with a solemn rhythm that felt almost cruel in its order. Words were spoken that everyone in Redwood Hollow had heard before, yet this time they landed differently, heavy, final. As the priest lifted his hands in prayer, the congregation responded in unison, but the sound of their voices seemed to wash past Grace Coleman without reaching her. From the front pew, Lily watched the adults bow their heads and close their eyes. She tried to follow, but her gaze kept drifting to the casket. It didn't make sense to her that her father was inside something so still, so quiet. She remembered his laugh filling the house, the way he sang off-key while cooking breakfast. None of that belonged here. Her fingers tightened around the sleeve of her black dress, as if holding on could stop the moment from moving forward. Noah sat rigid beside his sister, feet barely touching the floor. He didn't cry like the others expected him to. Instead, he stared at the polished wood with a confusion too big for words. Every few minutes, he glanced at his mother, waiting for some sign that this was temporary, that someone would stand up and explain the mistake. Grace stood when the priest invited the family forward. Her legs felt unsteady, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath her. The walk to the casket was only a few steps, yet it felt endless. Each one carried the weight of a future she hadn't planned, a silence she didn't know how to fill. As the final prayers were spoken, the priest's voice softened. He spoke of rest, of mercy, of hope beyond death. To him, it was sacred duty. To the congregation, a comfort. To Grace, the words pressed against a wound that was still raw, still bleeding. When the pallbearers moved into position, a quiet sob rippled through the church. The sound came from the back pews, from friends and neighbors who had known Ethan for years. Grace heard it all, yet she felt strangely distant, as if she were watching the scene from behind glass. This was the moment she had been dreading, the point of no return. Once the casket was carried away, nothing could be undone. No prayers could call him back. No faith could rewind time. As the closing hymn began, voices rose again, steady and familiar. But for Grace, the music blurred into a dull hum. Her chest tightened, breath shallow, heart breaking under the realization that the man she had loved was truly gone. And in that unbearable moment, surrounded by faith, by ritual, by people who cared, Grace stood face to face with the deepest grief of her life, unaware that this very moment would become the dividing line between who she had been and who she was about to become. As the final hymn faded, a hush settled over the church, one of those silences that feels heavier than sound. The priest stepped back from the altar, and the pallbearers paused, waiting for the signal to move. In that stillness, Grace Coleman felt something shift, subtle at first, like a change in the air before a storm. She lifted her eyes. Near the side aisle, where the candles cast long shadows against the stone walls, stood a man she had not noticed before. He was dressed entirely in white, ample and unadorned, yet impossible to overlook. The light around him seemed softer, warmer, as if it bent toward him without effort. Grace's breath caught in her throat. From Lily's place beside her, she sensed her mother's sudden stillness. Lily glanced up, expecting tears, but what she saw instead unsettled her. Grace's face had gone pale, her eyes wide, fixed on something beyond the casket. Lily followed her gaze, but saw only familiar faces, bowed heads, flickering candles. Grace could hear the church, the faint rustle of coats, the distant cough of an elderly man, but all of it felt far away. Her attention was drawn entirely to the man in white. When his eyes met hers, the grief crushing her chest loosened just slightly. There was no judgment in that gaze, no explanation, only a deep, unwavering compassion that seemed to say, "You are not alone." In that instant, Grace knew, without reasoning, without fear, that she was looking at Jesus Christ. The recognition did not come like thunder. It came quietly, settling into her heart with a certainty that startled her more than disbelief ever could. Time slowed. The pain of losing Ethan was still there, raw and real, but it was being held, shared by someone who understood it completely. Noah tugged at her hand, whispering her name, but Grace barely felt it. She took a half step forward, not to chase the vision, but as if drawn by a presence that offered strength without demanding anything in return. Then, as the pallbearers began to lift the casket, the man in white was no longer there. The candles still burned. The aisle remained empty. Life resumed its motion. But Grace swayed, steadying herself against the pew, as the weight of what had just happened settled in. To everyone else, the Mass continued as it always had. To Grace, the world had quietly split into before and after. From that moment on, the church would never feel the same to her, and neither would her faith. The drive home from the church passed in fragments. Redwood Hollow's familiar streets blurred behind the windshield, and Grace Coleman barely registered the turns she had taken 100 times before. Lily sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching her mother from the corner of her eye, while Noah leaned against the back window, unusually silent. Something unspoken had followed them out of the church. Inside the house, the door closed with a hollow sound that made Grace flinch. The air felt heavier than it had that morning, as if the walls themselves were waiting for an explanation. She set the keys down, then stood motionless, her heart still racing. The image of the man in white replayed again and again. His calm, his eyes, the peace that had wrapped around her grief like a hand on her shoulder. Was it real? Grace pressed her palms against the kitchen counter, breathing slowly, searching for logic, exhaustion, shock, a mind overwhelmed by loss. Every reasonable explanation lined up neatly, and yet none of them could account for the certainty that lingered in her chest. The grief had not vanished, but something else had entered it, something steady, unmistakable. Lily broke the silence first. "Mom, you were shaking in the church." Her voice was careful, almost afraid of the answer. Grace turned, forcing a small smile that didn't quite hold. She opened her mouth to reassure her daughter, to say it was nothing, that everything was fine. Instead, the truth slipped out. "I saw someone," she said quietly. Noah looked up at her then, confused. "Like a friend?" he asked. Grace hesitated. The word felt too small, too ordinary. She lowered herself into a chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "A man," she said, dressed in white. The room went still. Lily's eyes widened, searching her mother's face for signs of a joke or fear or tears. "Dad?" she whispered. Grace shook her head, emotion rising in her throat. "No," she said, almost pleading with herself as much as with her children. I think it was Jesus Christ." The words hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. Even as she spoke them, doubt rushed in. What if she was wrong? What if the pain had finally broken something inside her? She imagined how it would sound to others, desperate, unbalanced, a grieving widow clinging to fantasy. That night, after the children fell asleep, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table, the house wrapped in silence. She stared at the darkened window, replaying the moment in the church, testing it against reason again and again. "Am I losing my mind?" she whispered into the emptiness. No answer came, but neither did the peace leave her. By the next morning, Grace Coleman understood that whatever had happened in the church would not remain private for long. In a town like Redwood Hollow, silence traveled faster than confession, and concern often disguised itself as judgment. Her sister, Megan Harper, arrived before noon. She set a paper bag of groceries on the counter with more force than necessary and studied Grace's face the way one might examine a crack in the wall. "Lily called me," she said carefully. "She said you saw something at the funeral." Grace nodded, already bracing herself. Megan exhaled sharply and lowered her voice. "Grace, you've been through hell. You're exhausted. People see things when they're grieving." She reached across the table, squeezing her sister's hand. "Please don't tell anyone else. They won't understand. They'll think you're losing it." The words stung more than Megan intended. Grace looked down, unsure whether to defend herself or retreat into silence. She wanted to explain the calm, the certainty, but the moment she tried, it sounded fragile, almost foolish. Outside that kitchen, the town was already talking. At the grocery store, conversations dipped as Grace passed the aisle. At the school pickup line, a few parents exchanged glances that lingered a second too long. By afternoon, the story had been reshaped into something smaller and crueler. The poor widow couldn't handle the loss. Grief had finally broken her. Lily felt it at school when a classmate whispered, "Is it true your mom saw Jesus?" The question wasn't curious. It was sharp. Noah felt it when a boy on the playground laughed and said, "My dad says your mom's crazy." He shoved back, fists clenched, unable to explain what he didn't understand himself. At dinner, the house was quieter than usual. Grace watched her children, the way Lily avoided her eyes, the way Noah ate without looking up. She realized then that the doubt wasn't just aimed at her. It was touching them too. That night, as the town settled into darkness, Grace sat alone on the edge of her bed. The peace she had felt in the church now wrestled with something heavier. Fear. Not of being wrong, but of being alone in what she believed she had seen. The whispers outside grew louder. But inside her, the question grew sharper. If everyone doubted her, could she still trust what she knew in her heart? Father Daniel Reyes arrived just before dusk, when the heat of the day had finally loosened its grip on Redwood Hollow. He knocked gently, not with urgency, but with the patience of someone who had learned that sorrow needed space before answers. Grace opened the door and found his familiar, steady presence waiting on the porch, Bible tucked under one arm, rosary wound quietly around his fingers. Inside, the house was subdued. Lily and Noah lingered near the hallway, pretending to be busy, listening more than they let on. Father Daniel noticed their eyes, the tension in their shoulders, and offered them a warm nod before turning his attention to Grace. "I saw you during the Mass," he said after they sat at the kitchen table. "Your face changed." Grace hesitated. The words she had rehearsed all day suddenly felt inadequate. Still, she spoke slowly, carefully describing the man in white, the moment their eyes met, the peace that had wrapped itself around her grief. She did not ask him to believe her. She only told him what had happened. Father Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. He folded his hands and looked at her with a gentleness that did not dismiss, nor did it rush to affirm. "Grace," he said finally, "the church has learned to be cautious with moments like these, not because God is distant, but because people are fragile." He paused. "What matters most is not what was seen, but what it produces." Grace looked down, her voice trembling. "People are already talking. They think I'm imagining things." He nodded. "They might." Even the apostles were doubted. Then he leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, did this experience make you afraid?" "No," Grace answered without hesitation. "It made me feel held." "Then guard that," he said quietly. "Do not turn it into a spectacle. Do not try to convince anyone. If this was a grace from Jesus Christ, it was given to strengthen you, not to place you on a stage." From the hallway, Lily watched her mother's shoulders relax just a little. Noah edged closer, drawn by the calm in the room. Father Daniel continued, "True encounters with Christ rarely shout. They whisper, and they are proven not by attention, but by humility, patience, and love." Grace swallowed hard. "So what do I do?" "You live," he replied. "Care for your children, mourn your husband, pray when you can, and let time reveal the fruit." When he left, the house felt quieter but steadier. The doubts outside had not vanished. The whispers had not stopped. But Grace sensed something anchoring her now, something deeper than approval or disbelief. For the first time since the funeral, she did not feel the need to explain what had happened in the church. It was enough to carry it silently, faithfully, until its meaning became clear. The weeks that followed drained Grace Coleman in ways grief alone never had. Each morning demanded strength she no longer possessed. She rose before dawn, packed lunches with trembling hands, and forced a steady smile as she walked Lily and Noah to the car. To the town, she looked functional. To herself, she felt hollow. At school, the hallway light seemed harsher than before. Grace moved through her classroom on instinct, hearing her own voice as if it belonged to someone else. The children watched her closely. A few whispered that she looked pale. One afternoon, as she leaned over a student's desk, the room tilted, and she had to grip the chair to keep from falling. The principal called her in later that week. The words were careful, professional. "We're worried about you, Grace. The kids need consistency." The message beneath them was clear. If she didn't recover soon, someone else would take her place. She nodded, promising improvement she wasn't sure she could deliver. At home, Lily tried to fill the silence, cooking simple meals, folding clothes, acting older than her years. Noah withdrew, retreating into himself, his eyes tracking his mother with quiet fear. He noticed how often she coughed, how she rested her hand against her chest when she thought no one was looking. The breaking point came one night when Grace collapsed onto the couch, unable to catch her breath. Fever burned through her body, leaving her shaking and disoriented. Lily knelt beside her, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead, her voice barely steady. "Mom, please don't sleep. I'm going to call Aunt Megan." Grace tried to protest, but the words wouldn't come. In that moment, fear eclipsed everything else, not fear of pain or of doubt, but of absence. The thought struck with brutal clarity. If she was gone, her children would be alone. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the house settled into uneasy stillness, Grace lay awake, each breath an effort. The peace she had felt in the church seemed distant now, almost unreal. Doubt crept back in, sharper than before. Had she imagined it all? Had she mistaken comfort for truth? Her hand reached blindly toward the empty space beside her, where Ethan once slept. Tears slid into her hair as a prayer formed, unpolished and desperate. She did not ask for signs. She did not ask to be believed. She asked only for strength to remain, for Lily, for Noah, for one more day. And as the night stretched on, Grace hovered at the edge of exhaustion, unaware that this moment of surrender would become the threshold of something she could never have anticipated. The night deepened into a silence that felt almost unreal. The house was dark, the children finally asleep after hours of worry, and Grace Coleman lay motionless, her breath shallow, her body burning and cold all at once. Each inhale felt like a decision. Each exhale, a risk. Somewhere between waking and surrender, the edges of the room began to soften. Then the air changed, not with a sound, but with a presence, steady, unmistakable. The fever that raged through her seemed to pause, as if held back by something stronger. Grace opened her eyes. At the foot of the bed stood Jesus Christ. There was no fear in her, no shock this time. He was dressed as before, in white that did not glare but glowed gently, like morning light through clouds. The room felt warmer, safer, as if the weight pressing on her chest had been acknowledged rather than ignored. He did not speak at first. He simply stepped closer. From the hallway, the house remained quiet. Lily slept curled on the floor near the bedroom door, exhausted from watching over her mother. Noah breathed softly in his room, unaware of the moment unfolding just steps away. Jesus reached out and placed his hand upon Grace's forehead. The touch was light, almost tender, yet it carried a strength that moved through her instantly. The burning in her body receded, replaced by a calm that spread from her head to her chest, then outward, like warmth after a long winter. Her breathing steadied. The pain loosened its grip. Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes, not from suffering, but from relief so profound it felt holy. Grace closed her eyes for only a moment. When she opened them again, the room was empty. The night was the same, the walls, the shadows, the ticking clock, but her body was not. She drew in a deep breath, full, unstrained. She sat up slowly, stunned by the absence of pain. The fever was gone. The weight had lifted. By morning, Lily woke to find her mother standing in the kitchen, pale but upright, heating water on the stove. "Mom?" she whispered, fear and hope colliding in her voice. Grace turned and smiled, a real smile, the first in weeks. Later that day, the doctor examined her twice, flipping through charts in confusion. "This doesn't make sense," he admitted. "You shouldn't be better yet, but you are." Grace said nothing. She didn't need to explain what could not be measured, because she knew. Jesus Christ had returned, not to erase her pain, but to restore her strength. And with that healing touch, her life had quietly crossed a line from despair into purpose. Life did not return to normal after Grace Coleman's recovery. It moved forward cautiously, as if testing the ground beneath it. Her strength came back day by day, not with fanfare, but with quiet steadiness. She returned to school, resumed routines, and said little about the night she had been healed. Whatever had happened, she carried it inward, just as Father Daniel had advised. It was during the town's autumn festival that the second sign arrived. Redwood Hollow gathered on the church grounds for the annual fair string lights strung between oak trees, the smell of barbecue and kettle corn drifting through the air. Children ran freely, laughter mixing with music from a small stage. Grace stood nearby with Lily and Noah, grateful for the rare moment of lightness. Then the music stopped. A woman's voice cut through the crowd, sharp with panic. "My son, has anyone seen my son?" The words rippled outward, turning celebration into chaos. Parents grabbed their children, volunteers scattered. The boy was 5 years old, last seen near the playground. Grace felt her chest tighten, not with fear but with recognition. She remembered Noah slipping from her hand weeks earlier, the terror of losing M even for a moment. Without thinking, she stepped away from the crowd and closed her eyes briefly, not to ask for a miracle, but for guidance. In that quiet breath, a calm certainty settled over her, gentle, directional, as clear as a nudge. She opened her eyes and began walking, not toward the playground, but toward the far end of the grounds, near the old stone fountain where the music equipment had been unloaded earlier that morning. Behind her, Lily noticed. "Mom?" she called, confused. Grace didn't turn back. Near the fountain, amid discarded cups and coiled cables, stood the boy unhurt, clutching a balloon, watching the commotion from a distance. He looked up as Grace approached, blinking in surprise. She knelt and held out her hand. "There you are," she said softly. Moments later, the crowd surged toward them. The child's mother collapsed in relief, wrapping her son in trembling arms. Whispers spread quickly. How Grace had known where to look. How she had gone straight to him while everyone else searched blindly. Grace shook her head as people began to murmur. It wasn't me, she said quietly. I just followed what felt right. But even as she spoke, she sensed it, the same steady presence she had known before. Not dramatic, not loud, simply guiding. And once again, the town was left with a question it could not easily answer. The story of the lost child traveled faster than Grace Coleman ever could have imagined. By the next morning, it had escaped the boundaries of Redwood Hollow and taken on a life of its own. Phone calls came first, neighbors of neighbors, distant relatives, people asking questions Grace didn't know how to answer. Then the cameras arrived. A local news van parked across the street, its logo bright against the quiet neighborhood. A reporter knocked, polite but persistent, speaking of an incredible moment and a woman touched by God. Grace watched from the kitchen window as Lily's eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and excitement. For the first time since the funeral, people weren't whispering about her with pity. They were looking at her with awe. Grace felt only fear. I don't want this, she said, gently closing the door on the reporter. I didn't do anything. The words sounded thin even to her ears. The town wanted a story. The media wanted a face. And slowly, a dangerous idea began to form. That perhaps she was more than she truly was. The pressure followed her to church. Parishioners lingered after Mass, asking her to pray over them, to touch their rosaries, to speak a word over their children. An elderly woman knelt in front of her, pleading. Grace stepped back, shaken. Please, she whispered, lifting the woman to her feet. I'm no different than you. Not long after, Father Daniel asked her to come to the rectory. His expression was grave but kind. He spoke of phone calls to the parish office, of concerns raised beyond the town. The diocese has heard about what's happening, he said carefully. They want to meet with you. The meeting was brief and restrained. The diocesan representative listened, asked measured questions, then spoke with practiced caution. For the good of the faithful, we ask that you refrain from sharing claims of visions or miracles. Public devotion must remain centered on Jesus Christ, not on any individual. Grace lowered her eyes, her heart tightening. Obedience had always been simple for her. Now it felt costly. That night she sat alone, hands folded, wrestling with a question more difficult than doubt. If what she had experienced was real, if it had truly come from Christ, could she still honor it by remaining silent? In the quiet that followed, she chose the harder path. Grace stepped away from the attention. She declined interviews. She stopped explaining. Whatever grace had been given to her, she would guard it with humility, even if that meant misunderstanding would return. And in choosing to disappear from the spotlight, she discovered that the truest test of faith was not being believed, but being obedient. The storm arrived without warning, tearing through Redwood Hollow with wind and rain that turned quiet streets into rivers of mud. Power lines fell. Roofs peeled back. By dawn, the town stood stunned, surveying the damage in silence. It was in that silence that Grace Coleman stepped forward, not with words but with action. She moved from house to house, checking on the elderly, organizing meals from whatever kitchen still had gas, guiding volunteers to clear debris from the school entrance. Lily and Noah followed closely, carrying blankets and bottled water, learning by watching. Neighbors who once whispered now worked shoulder to shoulder, taking direction from a woman who never raised her voice and never took credit. When a frightened child slipped near the flooded ditch, Grace reached him first, pulling him back to safety without hesitation. No one called it a miracle this time. They called it courage. They called it love. And somehow, that was enough. In the days that followed, Redwood Hollow began to heal. Not perfectly, not quickly, but together. The church opened its doors as a shelter. The school reopened with patched roofs and donated supplies. Old resentments softened. Apologies were offered, some spoken, some only shown through acts of kindness. Grace's in-laws came quietly one evening, bringing tools and food, their eyes heavy with regret and gratitude. Grace welcomed them without bitterness. Grief had taught her how to forgive. On a calm afternoon, Grace visited the cemetery alone. She placed wildflowers at Ethan's grave and stood there, breathing steadily. The pain was still present, real, enduring, but it no longer ruled her. She understood now that Jesus Christ had not come to erase her suffering. He had come to walk with her through it and to show her how suffering could become service. Back in town, children laughed again in the schoolyard. Lights glowed in windows at night. Faith returned to its quiet place. Not loud, not sensational, but lived daily in patience, humility, and care for one another. Grace never spoke publicly about what she had seen. She didn't need to. Her life had become the testimony, and so, Redwood Hollow remembered her not as a woman who claimed a miracle, but as one who chose love when it mattered most. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that faith is strongest when it's lived quietly and shared generously, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Jesus Christ Encounters. Your support helps bring more stories of hope, healing, and faith to light.